So welcome to our study of Jamgon Mipham's Sword of Wisdom, the Nyingma approach to valid cognition. And it's true, and obviously it's true, but when we say the Nyingma approach to valid cognition, there are some things here that are specific to the Nyingma approach, but overall, the foundations of what we're studying here is really universal to all of Buddhism. The teachings from the Buddha themselves really constitute contain the spirit of valid cognition. The mere fact that the Buddha said, please do not trust my teaching on the basis of respect or faith in my person, but on the basis on your own inquiry. Just like before purchasing gold, you would verify the validity of what appears to be gold. So even there, the Buddha speaks about valid cognition, the critical thinking that assesses the value and the relevance of what the Buddha is teaching. So we have valid cognition from the very origin and the very nature of the Buddha's approach to examining critically our assumptions. Now, this particularly was formulated then by the likes of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, and that's where the more, you could say, formulated approach, the more formal approach to what we then call pramana was established. And this is something that we also have in the Indian traditions, and it's simply epistemology. It's simply valid what is flawed science and what is sound science. And that's where we then operate essentially with the same premises that we have in modern science, namely what we can validate through directly observing, directly seeing, and what we can infer logically. So we can understand things in terms of what we can see, there's a hand and so forth. We can validate that with our senses. And we also include within that, in the Buddhist context, experience of the mind. In terms of logic, there's also things like, for example, how many corners are there on a circle? And we would say, well, that's where our logic can tell us that there is no such a thing as corners on a circle. So we operate continually with these two, direct observation and logical inference. For example, even though we can't see the empty nature, we can understand that anything that is dependent necessarily is free of some sort of abiding inherent essence. So we are encouraged to approach the Buddha's teaching and our practice of the path of meditation, not on the basis of just what Songtse Khyentse Rinpoche calls inspiration disease, which is just the sort of the romantic feeling of, oh, this sounds just right. We could possibly do it, but the thing is, then we'd have to ignore the entire culture that surrounds us, that thinks in very different ways. And that's difficult. So if we're living in a culture where there's questioning, inquiry, critical thinking taking place, then we need to understand what it is we're doing with that which we probably consider the most important project in our entire existence, the path to awakening. And that's where we can't just have hard intelligence in sort of other areas of our life, and then sort of in the realm of enlightenment, well, that's sort of like a nice little sweet thing that we do, you know. There has to be, particularly in that area, a sound foundation for what it is that we are focusing on. So here then, we are presently looking at the valid cognition of relative and absolute truth, of which we have two kinds. So we'll be continuing with that. We'll begin with invoking the wisdom of Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche. Through the blessings of awareness emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So we are presently looking at then the summary of what we've been studying. I'll just refer, like I continually have been doing, to actually this sort of summary from Douglas Duckworth, where he says Mipham Rinpoche delineates two types of conventional valid cognition based on confined perception and pure vision. So that has to do with conventional valid cognition, conventional truth, relative truth, the valid cognition that sees relative truth. And that's where we operate, for example, in ordinary science that understands the temperatures at which, for example, metals melt, or the strength of particular metals, or the way that particles behave, and so forth, the findings of science, and so forth, within all areas, information technology, medicine, and so on. And all of that belongs to valid cognition that understands relative truth, and that's confined perception. Then we have the pure vision, that which the subject, the consciousness, the experiencer that no longer is confused, and that then begins to see clearly the nature of emptiness and the nature of appearances. And that's where we talk about pure vision. And similarly also then with ultimate valid cognition, Douglas Duckworth says his two conventional valid cognitions are similar to his two ultimate valid cognitions, those that concern the categorized and uncategorized ultimate, in that the division is grounded in two distinct modes of understanding, a delimited conceptual mode of mind and an inconceivable mode of mind. And that refers to understanding absolute truth, the nature of emptiness, shunyata, which stands in opposition to our ordinary confused assumptions that both our consciousness, our subject, possesses an inherent self, and similarly also the object, the field of our perceptions, that these objects that we see, that they possess inherent essence. And that's shunyata. We approach in two ways. There's valid cognition that understands this logically as a truth, just like we can understand truths around the world around us in terms of gravity and what have you. All the truths that we sort of can understand, we understand with the mind intellectually. And similarly also we need to understand the nature of emptiness. But that understanding of emptiness is logical, it's intellectual, and ultimately the realization of emptiness is far greater. The relative understanding of emptiness is essential for our faith and for our practice of the path, for understanding what on earth we're doing in terms of the path. But at the same time, we can also see that there's a vast difference between someone like myself and someone who's a sage, someone who has genuine realization. And that's where we then talk about the inconceivable mode of wisdom, which is when there's complete realization of emptiness. So one is an understanding, the other is realization. So these two ways of understanding, on one hand, relative truths, where there's two kinds, and understanding absolute truth, where there's also two kinds. These are what then we have been discussing in here in terms of this chapter, conventional and ultimate valid cognition. So we'll now look at the summary of this chapter, where then Jamgon Mipham says, by relying on the former, one engages the latter. It is like clearing one's eye of a flaw. Once the eye of valid cognition is thoroughly cleansed, one will see the reality of purity and equality. So this is very often we find these kind of formulations in you could say pith instructions and teachings. When we say by relying on the former, so when we have relative truth, for example, we talk about confined valid cognition and pure valid cognition, or the valid cognition of pure vision, right? So that's in relative truth. And that's where when we say by relying on the former, we rely first on the confined valid cognition, and it's on the basis of the confined valid cognition, you could say the ordinary science of our conventional experience, that it's relying on that we then graduate to a greater degree of valid cognition, which is then the valid cognition of pure seeing, of pure vision. And again, this is where we need to understand that pure perception is not imagination or something that's a little bit sort of out there with the fairies. It's about hard investigation into the nature of our reality. And that's going beyond just an investigation that merely asserts what we, of course, we need to navigate our ordinary world in terms of understanding how it functions. So that's where science, the modern science, is definitely unprecedented in its ability to understand matter and navigate it. But understanding the nature of this is not at all clear and basically not really within the scope of the ordinary science. And that's where the remarkable science that we have operates on a relatively superficial level. What we're proposing here is a deeper analysis into the nature of what appears to be a phenomenal world in which it appears to be solid. But that's where we're going beyond that and beginning to see actually there's nothing there to be grasped. There's projections that come from the subject, but the object itself is merely just appearances on the basis of a web of interdependent conditions. So that's where we see with pure vision, we see the unity of this appearance and this emptiness. So on the basis of that, we have then pure vision, a deeper insight, and that is the vision of the sage. So that's where we say by relying on the former, one engages the latter, and that's in the case of the relative truth. In terms of the absolute truth or the absolute valid cognition, then it's on the basis of understanding shunyata, emptiness, that we then gain realization of shunyata. So that's where that we speak here about having an eye, which is very good, but it's not seeing so well. So that's where we presently then clear the eye, and that's what we're doing on the practice of the path, on the basis of developing the three prajnas, hearing, reflecting, and meditating. Then we begin to see the eye begins to see better. The eye becomes thoroughly cleansed, and that's where we then see the reality of purity and equality. And purity and equality are essentially the higher way, the greater way of understanding the two truths. We're familiar with the notion of the two truths as conventional truth, how things appear, and how they actually are. One is how we see things without questioning, without analysis. The other is to understand the nature of phenomena when we apply analysis, when we investigate. So these two truths, they're universal all across the Buddhist teaching. But here, we're engaging in a greater kind of understanding of the two truths, which is understanding the purity of the relative truth and the inconceivability of absolute truth. And that's where the two truths that we often refer to, and we often see this, for example, if we practice Vajrayana sadhana, so often there's reference to purity and equality. The purity of relative phenomena and the equality of absolute truth, the space in which confusion and non-confusion are equal. Samsara and nirvana, they are merely relative constructs on the basis of the confused or non-confused subjectivity, but reality itself abides forever by nature in equality, in which samsara and nirvana are essentially unborn and not, you could say, they're not present within the nature of the absolute. And so that's why we say samsara and nirvana, they're equal within the absolute truth. But this is again where we are in, this is an example of where we're talking about the Nyingma approach to valid cognition. This is very much part of what we call Nyingma Dharma vocabulary. But this, of course, also is something that pervades the practices that we find in the Kagyu tradition. And we should also understand that even though the words are particular to the Nyingma, then of course the logic is basic to all the Buddhist traditions universally. So Khenpo Palden Sherab, he then comments, there are two types of valid cognition for each of the two truths. So altogether, there are four types of valid cognition. By relying on the former, one engages the latter. This means that for the valid cognition that investigates conventional reality, one temporarily relies on the conventional valid cognition of ordinary perception, the impure way things appear, in order to eventually engage in the conventional valid cognition based on the vision of sublime beings, the pure way things really are. So again, we have a conventional valid cognition that we use, the logic, and you could say the rigor of science, the rigor of understanding our relative world. That science, the rigor of that, we appreciate and use that for then understanding the nature of how phenomena abides as pure, and also understanding that this is what is seen by those who have little or no obscuration. So then, for the valid cognition that investigates ultimate reality, one must start by temporarily relying on the valid cognition that investigates the expressible ultimate in order to eventually engage in the valid cognition that investigates the inexpressible ultimate. So essentially, to arrive at the inexpressible experience of realization, one needs to begin with what we can do in terms of rational understanding, in terms of an intellectual, clear understanding of what we mean with the absence of inherent existence, what we mean with the nature of ultimate truth. That's essential for us to begin our journey and to understand what is meant with the teachings. So Khenpo Palden Sherab continues, for example, and again, this is about, one leading to the other. For example, when someone has an eye disorder, like cataracts, to the extent that the flaw in the eye is cleared up, the person will see clearly. It is similar for the eye of intelligence, the eye of valid cognition. By being thoroughly cleansed, this eye will comprehend just as it is the reality of the two truths, the true nature of all phenomena. This is not the object of the former two types of valid cognition, ordinary perception, and the expressible ultimate. It is the domain of the latter two types of valid cognition, pure vision and the inexpressible ultimate. So what we are attending here, or attempting, really is to arrive at seeing clearly both absolute truth and relative truth. And seeing relative truth will not be achieved if we just look at things with an ordinary, seeing things as they are ordinarily. And also will not understand ultimate truth if we just rely on the ideas, if we just have some idea of emptiness. So that's where we need to graduate from the initial understanding that's based on our present ordinary level of perception. We need to, on the basis of the path, eliminating confusion, creating all the right conditions, then graduate to a greater understanding of both relative truth and absolute truth and ultimate truth. Khenpo Palden Sherab says, on the conventional level, the ultimate way things are is great purity. On the absolute level, the ultimate way things are is great equality. And again, these are two important terms in terms of understanding the two truths. This is what we call the higher two truth, Tlakpe Deni, the superior two truths. the great purity and great equality, Takpa Chenpo and Nyamba Chenpo. So Khenpo Palden Sherpa says, Mipham is affectionately instructing us that if we want to attain liberation, we must endeavor to use the skillful means of the 4 types of valid cognition. This would enable us to see the very profound view of the inseparable truth of purity and equality. Okay. That's an important point. Now there's going to be some, and included in this chapter, it's kind of a little bit sort of a general appendix to the entire field that we're discussing here, but it's included as a section of this chapter 13. But in a way, we've covered the main subject in chapter 13, which is, valid cognition of conventional and ultimate truth. But here comes a little bit of a discussion around the whole project of valid cognition pramana. And understandably, there's some objections, and that's good. That will enable us to be more certain about what it is that we're doing. The first is to say, you can't actually know anything. It's impossible to really know things. And this is a theme that comes up a lot in Western epistemology and universally, even within our ordinary life, we'll say things like, you just cannot know these things, or you'll say, well, it won't sort of give us a real picture of how things are. And some will even say, well, it's not necessary to even bother to try to understand things. So that's kind of, it's confused, it's slightly lazy, and it essentially doesn't really take us anywhere in terms of us becoming clearer on what it is we're doing. So there are these 3, there's these 3 here that we'll look at. These are general objections. One, that valid cognition is impossible. You can't, you'll never really you can never really know anything. The other is unestablished, that what you know might not just give an accurate understanding of how things really are. And finally, what it is again, it's unnecessary, that you don't need to sort of bother about trying to understand things. Now this I'm presenting in a slightly, how do you say, casual way. And but it is quite specific. It's something that applies within the natural questioning that comes up when it comes to spiritual matters. And it's something that is so pervasive in our culture when people dismiss spirituality. They'll say, well, we can never know these things, or whatever we know won't really be sort of valid. And also within the tradition itself, you might say, well, I'm just going to meditate. I don't need to go through all this hassle of investigating things, So there are these different objections that could come up. So it's helpful to have a perspective on these. It's not that we necessarily have to go out and defend the faith, but at the same time also, it's rather good that we have some answers to these, you could say, natural concerns that come up. So here then, refuting objections to valid cognition. The third main section of inferential valid cognition is comprised of responses that dispel objections. Oh yes, this is important, because that's actually this is a part of when we have the entire topic of inferential valid cognition. And this is the biggie there. We have direct perception and we have inferential valid cognition, right? Or the direct valid cognition, simply seeing things without concepts, or now here inferential valid cognition, which is what we've been looking at. And this is then concludes really this section with discussing the objections. So So then it has two parts, the general and specific. So we'll look at I think today we'll just look at the general. So valid cognition is impossible. So first, to respond to the objection that valid cognition is impossible, the root text says, and then Jamgon Mipham writes, both the non-conceptual mind and the conceptual mind have undiluted aspects as well as diluted aspects, like perceiving two moons, dreams, and a rope as a snake. Therefore, two categories of valid cognition and non-valid cognition are established. Without both valid cognition and non-valid cognition, it would be impossible to distinguish what is false due to delusion from what is true and undiluted, and there would be no philosophy. So philosophy you could define as that which looks beyond appearances. It's philosophy that the moment that we begin to analyze, the moment that we begin to investigate, to see beyond what appears. It's something that we operate with all the time. We do it in our assessment of other people. We do it in our assessment of our finances, our future. And we also apply it in a deeper sense, in a more universal way, when we try to understand the nature of reality. And particularly in the Buddhist context, we do this because we understand that our suffering originates from not understanding reality, from not having investigated reality, and we're simply lost. And that's where philosophy simply means to investigate and go beyond our naive assumptions and our assumptions around appearances. Now, it's in that context then that we're clear that we have both the non-conceptual mind, the mind that just perceives, and the conceptual mind, the mind that labels things and develops understanding around things, that there's clearly seeing properly and seeing in a confused way. This goes without saying. So I think it's quite clear, but it's on the basis of that we can then make proper choices. We use this as, discerning consumers. We use this in terms of getting our accounts right. We do this in terms of assessing people. We do this in terms of understanding the nature of reality. So this is something that we continually operate with. So we can't say, or there will be made a strong argument for here that to say that valid cognition is impossible, that we couldn't properly know, doesn't apply. And it also doesn't apply to the spiritual dimension. We can very well see that this mind of ours, that is what we rely on and that constructs our reality, that is basic to all our perceptions, it can be diluted and not diluted. And also what's interesting is this is dynamic. This is something we can be more or less diluted. So we could already immediately, we can assert that we are in a very empowered position in terms of being more or less confused. It's a bit like if we can't figure out our sums and our math, we simply have to sit down and think about it and go through it, and eventually we arrive at an understanding. So that's where we can assert that we can know what is and what isn't, what's valid and what's not valid. So Khenpo Palden Sherp, he says, someone might think that even if there is valid cognition, it is impossible not to be deluded. Our tradition would respond that both non-conceptual mind and the conceptual mind can be either undiluted or diluted. On the one hand, the sense consciousnesses can be undiluted, as can the two kinds of mental consciousness, the non-conceptual type that does not mix objects with names, and the conceptual type that does mix objects and names. So again, this is where we might say, oh, it's impossible not to be confused. Well, that's a sort of a vague assumption. And in fact, when we investigate, we can see actually, no, it is with regards to the various ways that we perceive, it is absolutely possible to be clear on what is and what isn't. A diluted sense consciousness is like the eye consciousness seeing two moons instead of one. A diluted non-conceptual mental consciousness is like experiencing a dream. And a deluded conceptual mental consciousness is like apprehending a multicolored rope as a snake. So that's simply just, we can see, we might have knocked our heads and then we're seeing two moons or stars or whatever. and that's where we can be clear that that's not right. There are not two moons, and the stars we're seeing are not actually there. So likewise also, we might think that there's a real tiger running after us in a dream. And again, that's something which it's delusion. It's not actually happening. And then finally, there is this misapprehension of a rope as a snake. Again, there is no snake. So it's clear that if we investigate, there's a huge difference between whether or not we are deluded. So it's very possible for us to eliminate delusion, and we do so, and this is also really interesting, we do so not on the basis of holding our breath or going into some particular samadhi or anything. We do this on the basis of investigation. We look. It doesn't have to be something cerebral. It's really just about investigating, looking. And then, yes, then the samadhi is that which takes us from just an understanding into a deeper realization, deeper experience and deeper realization. That's what samadhi does. But we're not introducing some new mystical dimension. We're simply applying, or rather we look, we investigate, we open our eyes. That's how we arrive at non-delusion. So it is possible for us to go beyond delusion. So then Khenpo Palden Sherp then says, an undiluted consciousness is unmistaken. So it is valid cognition. We can clearly see there is just one moon. We understand it's just a dream. And we look and see there is in fact no snake, that's just a rope. That's valid cognition. He says, but a deluded consciousness is mistaken, so it's not valid. Those that will tell you that there's two moons, they've had a bit too much to drink, or they hit their head or whatever, or those who are suffering from a nightmare, or those who see a rope as a snake, all of these, you could say these are invalid assumptions. So we can distinguish between valid and invalid. So these are established as as distinct categories through the reasoning based on the power of facts. Again, we're just relying on what we can observe. If one could not clearly distinguish valid cognition from non-valid cognition, it would be impossible to divide what is false because of being deluded from what is true, because of being what is true because of, hold on. If one could not clearly distinguish valid cognition from non-valid cognition, it would be impossible to divide what is false because of being deluded from what is true because of being undeluded. So we can see it both in terms of ourselves, and we can also see it, externally. Someone who is delusional, someone who is not delusional. Consequently, it would be impossible to establish the falsity of non-Buddhist philosophy and the truth of Buddhist philosophy. So here, Buddhist philosophy doesn't mean our little particular pet project, our little Buddhism, our little ism. It means understanding reality. It means understanding what is sound science, distinguishing that from flawed science. It's the difference between your car is in working condition and it's safe to drive, or it's got an issue and it's dangerous to drive. It's that kind of insight into the nature of things. It's the same with medicine, and it's the same also with the reason that we wander in samsara is because of a delusion, and that's where we need to be able to distinguish what is valid in terms of eliminating the delusion that perpetuates samsara, and how can we assess the validity of a teacher, for example, and a teaching. And that's where it's essential really to operate with this valid cognition. So valid cognition is unestablished, meaning that it ultimately doesn't hold. So second, for the objection that valid cognition is not established, the root text says, when one investigates the authentic absolute truth, One uses direct perception and inference, and valid cognition and non-valid cognition. In the same way that these are classifications, they are conceptual constructs. So that's actually the critique. And then the response is, however, their nature is established as empty, and therefore beyond all constructs. Emptiness is in all conventional constructs, just like heat is in fire. Therefore, appearance and emptiness abide inseparably in all phenomena, as the means and what arises from the means. So one cannot affirm one of them and negate the other. So what we mean here is that there's an objection that the absolute nature is something that is beyond constructs, and any kind of way that we might assess that is a conceptual constructs, and that's in a way true. But the point is that the arguments that we're using and the conventional reality that we're operating with when we assess something as valid and invalid, yes, of course they're empty. The whole conventional reality is empty. But the point is that we can, on the basis of understanding the nature of things, we can understand that which lies beyond conceptual constructs. So it's not as if we have, on one hand, we just have a reality that is valid, some absolute nature that cannot be described, and then we have a relative nature that can be described. We're using description here in both cases, and we'll do that with the understanding that we are operating with emptiness. So to use the language of conventions to establish the absolute nature is in no way wrong. So we can use language, and it's helpful for us to do that in terms of assessing the ultimate. But of course, we also understand all the time that the language we're using within the conventional, yes, of course, that too is empty. So Jakob Mipham Rinpoche says, Khenpo Pasan Sherab, he says, someone might think that valid cognition is not established for the ultimate, that when authentic reality is investigated and logically analyzed through reasoning that investigates the ultimate, terminology is used like the valid cognition of direct perception and inference, and the non-valid cognition of direct perception and inference, and other classifications like negating and affirming and subjects and objects. In the same way that these are classifications, they are conceptual constructs. And so, yes, you could criticize the whole project of pramana as being just conceptual constructs. And that's a little bit of sort of a lazy, sloppy way of just sort of avoiding the issue that we actually need to give a hard look at reality, you know? We can't just say, well, it's all just concepts, man, you know? That's not going to get us very far. And of course, you could say, yes, that's true, but it could very well lead to not doing anything about things. So Mipham Rinpoche, Khenpo Pasan Sherab, commenting on Mipham Rinpoche, says, our tradition would respond that by their very nature, all classifications are established as emptiness beyond constructed extremes. Because of being free of all constructs, such as existence, non-existence, both existence and non-existence, or neither existence nor non-existence, suchness pervades all conventional constructs in the same way that heat pervades fire. So, of course, using the skillful means that we have in relative truth is helpful, and in no way is it apart from the absolute nature. So we would say suchness as reality pervades conventional constructs that we use. For this reason, both appearance, such as a pot, and emptiness, the fact that the pot is unestablished, are present in all conventional phenomena and can never be separated. It is said. So that's where us talking about the nature of phenomena as being empty and assessing the nature of emptiness in any given phenomenon, such as a vase or a pot, is simply just assessing the nature of all reality, which is always this inseparability of emptiness and appearance. So it is said, Khenpo Palden Sherpa says, it is said that appearance is skillful means and emptiness is what arises from skillful means. So that means that we look at appearances, and they are appearances no different from emptiness. The nature of any appearance is emptiness, and emptiness is in no way obstructed. It manifests appearances, but it's on the basis of us investigating the aspect of appearance, the skillful means, and understanding its nature. And that's why you could say it's skillful. Appearances enable us, they're like the doorway to emptiness. And that's why on the basis of that, we then experience or have insight into the nature of emptiness. So he says, so one cannot affirm only the ultimate and negate the conventional, saying, oh yeah, there's only this absolute nature and that's valid. All the sort of the language and so forth that we use in terms of negation and understanding and so forth, oh, that's just conventional concepts. So one cannot affirm only the ultimate and negate the conventional, or affirm only the conventional and negate the ultimate, meaning we can only know what we can see. What is beyond, we could never know. That sort of thing. This is sloppy science, laziness. And of course, one is free to do that, but then there's not really any engagement with truth, and there's not really any foundation for a path. So that's where this needs to be you say that flawed view needs to be refuted. The inseparable truth of emptiness and appearance is the reality of all phenomena. This is why the Heart Sutra says, form is emptiness, emptiness also is, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is no other than emptiness, emptiness is none other than form. This accords with the Buddha's words that negate constructs involving any of the four extremes of existence, non-existence, both, or neither. So in fact, we cannot say that phenomena exist the way we ordinarily think of it, and also on the basis of thinking that phenomena exist in a particular way as real, we then say, well, then it exists sometimes and sometimes it doesn't exist, you know. Now I'm alive, now I'm not alive. Now I had this, now I don't have that. In that phenomena never have come into existence, they can't be squeezed into these pigeonholes, these what we call extremes of existence, non-existence. And not existing in these ways, also trying to sort of say, oh, they're both existing and non-existing, or they're neither, also doesn't work. So this is, of course, something that again and again comes up in the teaching, and it's something that is mind-boggling, but it's something that we want to actually get to the bottom of. That's where we develop really strong, irreversible faith with regards to the nature of the teaching and the path. Then there's valid cognition is unnecessary. And this is interesting. Just from the point of view that there would be those that say, oh yeah, you know, just all phenomena are just like an illusion. No need to investigate anything. Valid cognition is unnecessary. Third, for the objection that valid cognition is unnecessary, the root text says, if one asks whether someone can engage in the absolute truth merely by seeing the world without investigating it according to valid cognition or non-valid cognition, indeed, there is nothing to prevent that from happening. In seeing how this arose from that, worldly people use inference, which deduces the meaning by relying on direct perception. Even though they do not designate the things with those words, the meaning is not forsaken. And this is interesting because that we have in the Madhyamika, where we would say the prasangikas, they simply just rely on the non-conceptual wisdom of what we call equipoise or meditation. And in there's no concepts of absolute and relative truth. And that's what they rely on. They don't go into all the analysis that we have elsewhere. And when it comes to then the ordinary perceptions that in post-meditation, then they simply just approach it like we call the cowherd or the shepherd, somebody without any kind of interest in analysis, and simply just understanding that yes, there's relative truth as it exists in terms of us understanding the ordinary world just as it appears. Then there's this reliance on that is without any particular philosophical inclination, and simply just relying on the ordinary perceptions of the world, and that in itself also could indicate the truth of emptiness. Simply just identifying that yes, the concepts that we have, left and right. Left is dependent on right. Long is dependent on short. And that's where we say, from this arose that. And that really just means that everything stands, everything exists in relation, everything exists as imputations on the basis of our concepts, simply just labeling. So Khenpo Palden Sherab, he says, someone might ask, people who see according to the conventions of the world, like the Prasangikas, do not investigate by discriminating between valid cognition and non-valid cognition. So again, Prasangikas, like I just said, they're these persons that abide by actually the highest view. It is actually the highest view. The Prasangika, like I said, is a form of the Madhyamika, and we would say it's the highest form of Madhyamika, in which then all the investigations that we operate here, they don't apply that. Tsongtse Rinpoche refers to the Prasangikas as the hippies. But hippies here, what he means with that is not the sort of sloppy style, but rather just that they, because of the superior insight into the nature of reality, they don't need to undertake these investigations. So this is you could say this is the highest view really that goes beyond the ordinary efforts of trying to understand things. So that's why universally across the board in Tibetan Buddhism, the Prasangikas are viewed as the Prasangika Madhyamika is viewed as the highest view. At the same time, there's also the notion that for persons that are new to the path, for those that are not superior, it's very helpful to approach you could say the nature of shunyata and so forth, the nature of this non-conceptual wisdom through an understanding. Otherwise, very difficult to approach it. It means like it's sort of like expecting that all of a sudden you can jump up to the moon, sort of thing. And that's where, indeed, that could be the highest. You could have the highest view that's there, but it could be very difficult to actually attain that. And without that attainment, then, in fact, then everything is lost. If we just rely on something that we actually don't have a grasp of, then we're not really going to go anywhere. And that's why Mipham Rinpoche so much emphasizes the value of this approach of the two truths, what is known as the Svatantrika approach, the Svatantrika Madhyamika, which agrees with the Prasangika. I think we discussed this earlier. It agrees with the Prasangika completely as far as absolute truth goes, but with regards to relative truth, with regards to understanding the path and engaging with the path, that's where they would say it's quite helpful to have an understanding of the two truths that approach this in terms of understanding the nature of our appearances and how they appear, particularly according to, like we looked at last time, I think, the Yogacarya approach, understanding how the mind creates how all our appearances, and also understanding rationally the nature of emptiness. So that's the Svatantrika approach, which is quite helpful. But nevertheless, we have to agree, yes, if the Prasangikas without any investigation go ahead, then that's fine. So that's where he says, would merely accepting relative reality be enough for them to directly access the ultimate? If so, then the categories of valid cognition and non-valid cognition are unnecessary. Our tradition would respond, he says, that there are indeed nothing to prevent one from accessing the ultimate without using the classifications of valid cognition and non-valid cognition. So that's where you got to say, okay, if you can do that, good on you, mate, you know? However, ordinary people use valid cognition when, for example, they see a seed as the cause that gives rise to a sprout as its effect, and that effect is dependent on the seed and its cause. And that's why ordinary people, they might not ask any questions, but, and that's the cowherd approach, but then again, they might. And they might see, this particular seed grows better if we apply, proper manure, if we apply the ideal conditions. And that's where investigation can be quite helpful in terms of the conventional. So he says this entails the valid cognition of direct perception as well as the valid cognition of inference, seeing things and also thinking about them or inferring logically how things work, which deduces the existence or non-existence of a hidden phenomenon by relying on the direct perception of evidence. So that's where we can see things arise as dependent arising. If they do so, we can use, even though we can't see the emptiness of phenomena, we can deduce it. Therefore, even though worldly people do not specifically designate things with the names valid cognition or non-valid cognition, the meaning of those terms is not lost. Worldly people rely on valid cognition and non-valid cognition when they accept or reject things, affirm or negate them, or engage in or refrain from them. So that's just like if we see what's true and what's not true. If we engage with politics, we're trying to see who is making valid statements. Are the valid statements that are being made, or the statements being made, are they valid or invalid? And similarly, also, if we buy something, we're going to see, is it something that really lasts or has the qualities that we're looking for, and so forth. So we are all the time operating with valid and what is here known as non-valid cognition. That means just knowing what is valid and what is not valid. So the categories, valid cognition and non-valid cognition, are highly necessary. So that's where then also with regards to us engaging in the understanding of the nature of phenomena, understanding the two truths, emptiness and so forth, it's quite helpful to use this insight into what is valid, what is not valid. Oh, so I've gone a little bit over time here. I haven't given much time to questions. Okay, I'll do that now. Can you please give an example of the expressible ultimate? Is it the notion of emptiness? What else can it be? Yeah, the expressible ultimate is simply just the conceptual understanding that something that is a dependent arising, let's say that we have here, what I think I mentioned this last time also, right? Elizabeth Mathis Namdyal's sort of notion of, is this one or two? And that's where we can understand it's neither one nor two. We're labeling it A-frame, we're labeling it roof, we're labeling it hat, I don't know. But that's where we think of an object as being a thing. And it's not a thing because it's made up of a number of conditions, a roof and all its beams and rafters. Similarly also, we can also not say this is not many different things. It's not like there's many different roofs. There's just one roof. So these concepts that we attribute, these labels that we attribute, we can see that they're invalid, and they are in fact just a web of causes and conditions. And as such, all the afflictions of attachment and aversion and all the impulses and the causes of suffering that we perpetuate, they're actually founded on some assumptions that are invalid. So when we first understand that, that's expressible ultimate. And it's that what we take with us when we begin to investigate phenomena. Anytime that we begin to question, we're approaching this insight into the expressible ultimate. When we then, through the practice of the path, realize that, and the ordinary afflictions and all the ordinary styles of attachment and aversion, they fall away. And the clarity that is free from these dualistic fixations emerges as realization, then that's the inexpressible ultimate. Could one argue, though, okay, that was the one question, then there's another question. Could one argue, though, that while there is more or less deluded, there is still no such a thing as entirely non-deluded? That's basic to our culture. That's where for the modern person, the idea of a Buddha is inconceivable. That there could be somebody who's free from delusion, inconceivable. It doesn't exist in our culture. And that's where sometimes the term enlightenment is confusing, because we, in the Buddhist teaching, when we refer to enlightenment, we refer to somebody who is entirely non-deluded. Whereas in the Western context, it means something very different. So, but awakening, the possibility of complete awakening, that's what's special for the Buddhist teaching. And that's also why we need to understand this is not some project that you just sort of, hang around the Buddhist teaching and then, feeling better, slightly less deluded, a little bit more compassionate, and so forth. If we look at the life of the great sages, it's on the basis of very determined application that there is the complete elimination and the complete arrival at perfection. And even so, we would still say, you approach any great master and they would still say, oh, I'm still on the path. Even great masters like Nagarjuna, we would still say is on the 8th bhumi. But there's very much the entire, you say, premise of the Buddha's teaching is that there is perfect enlightenment. And that's where we also do identify sages as, as achieving perfect enlightenment. For example, the signs like the rainbow body and other, because there's extraordinary signs of completely dissolving all dualistic fixation, imply the validity of this condition that is entirely non-deluded. Why a tiger in a dream is said to be deluded non-conceptual mental constructs? It looks very conceptual to me. Simply just because it's a good question. I'm a little bit insecure actually on answering that, I have to say. But just speculating right here off the cuff, I would say it's really just perception. It's simply just a perception in a dream. So it's not happening, but it's just simply a perception. It doesn't come with a particular label as such. But yeah, I should look at that again. I would say think about it. We're in the same place, you and I. So we could just go back to the text, and perhaps your guess is as good as mine. But I'll have a look at it afterwards here. When I finally see the snake is actually a rope, may it still be that my seeing of the rope is still in a dream? My seeing of the rope is still in a dream, and therefore deluded. Yeah, strictly speaking, then that would fall into the category of the tiger. That would also be a deluded non-conceptual mental consciousness, but it would still be valid. It would still, yes. As far as the insight into the nature of the perception is concerned within the relative experience of the dream, it would be a valid understanding. But the dream itself is then a deluded condition where it's not actually taking place. We're getting tricky here, guys. Anyway, I hope the meaning is coming across more or less clearly. Yeah. Okay, so Yeah, I'll have a look at that in terms of these classifications of the deluded consciousnesses. Yeah, there was 3, right? So try to distinguish these 3. I'll try to get back to that next time. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night, realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning. May we cross the ocean of existence in that life, thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world. May we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you very much. Thank you for your good questions.